Now our next speaker in line is Mr. A. Rafeq, past member, COBIT 5 Task Force, ISACA. And he's going to talk on IT control objectives for cloud computing, controls and assurances in the cloud. Mr. Rafeq is an IT governance and assurance professional from Bangalore, India, with experience over 25 years in varied roles such as CFO, CIO, IT implementer, IT consultant, IT auditor, and COBIT trainer. Presently, he is the managing director of Windsor Inforeg Limited, which specializes in developing data analysis for auditors and BI tools for management.
I am delighted to be here to speak at the Cloud Connect conference. Before I start my presentation, there are a few disclaimers. I do not represent any vendors. I am not here to sell any product. I am representing ISACA, which is a global organization, which is a not-for-profit organization which provides best practices on information technology governance, assurance, security and controls. So I happen to be a member of ISACA since 1996, and ISACA has got different offerings, and it also provides certifications. And they asked me to make a presentation on the offerings they have, the best practices they have on cloud computing. ISACA believes that cloud is the way in the near future, and based on this they've actually come out with different publications, white papers, best practices which could be used by IT professionals, by IT governance professionals, by management, and by common people like us. Before I start my presentation, I would like to tell you that I will not be using any technology jargon. So if you're looking for S3, RAID or band, I'm not band or bandwidth or anything like that, I'm not going to use any technology jargons. What I'm sharing with you is the best practices on cloud computing, the best practices on IT governance, assurance and risk and security and control which can be used. I would like to know how many of you are aware of ISACA? Any of you? Okay, good. How many of you are auditors? Not many, okay. Okay, let's get started. If you look at the presentation title, it says IT control objectives for cloud computing, controls and assurance in the cloud. Now this is a strange topic, especially in a cloud computing conference, but I think this is the most important topic. If you look at any conference on information system security, or in a cloud environment, it's important you need to know what are these controls, what is security, and what are the risks. The agenda of my presentation today would be 4 key aspects I would like to cover. How to use the cloud to create value, what are the best practices to examine assurance in the cloud, how you can use COBIT. We'll also look at what is COBIT all about. COBIT in its earlier avatar was control objectives for information related technology. We had earlier version of COBIT 4.1. Now we have COBIT 5. I'll also talk about it a little later. COBIT is a collection of best practices for controls. It also includes best practices which can be used for governance, security and assurance. So we'll talk about how COBIT best practice can be used. What you'll find as you go on through the presentation, especially when you talk about COBIT or any of the ISACA offerings, is that these are common sense. These are the most critical questions which you should ask from a business perspective. So you'll find most of my presentation is not based on what technology can do for you, because I'm not looking at the mechanics of technology, I'm looking at the mechanism of how you can make technology work for the business. I believe fundamentally that technology exists for the business and not vice versa. So if you're looking at technology from the business perspective, it is important you should know how you can make technology create business value. And clouds you find are everywhere. So is there a reality, or is it a myth, or is it a hype? It's important we need to decipher what cloud can do for your enterprise and what cloud can do for your career. The fundamental objective in any IT deployment is the IT deployment should be able to ensure that the business is able to derive value. If you look at the Indian scenario, quite often you will find the statistics are a little amazing, and these are collected from different sources. That's why you may find a little difference in the figures between the different statistics. What's surprising is that India is supposed to be ahead as the cloud computing is concerned in terms of the percentage of cloud computing. In fact, I wrote an article on cloud computing for the CA journal, and I got an email from one of the vendors in the US. He says, how can it be true? So then I gave him the sources from which the statistics were obtained. So it shows that knowingly or unknowingly, we are moving on the cloud. More and more we're migrating to the cloud. So if you look at the market for cloud, you're all aware, I think since last 2 days you have been hearing that cloud computing is here to stay and is going to make a major impact. What is important especially is the transformation which cloud can bring about to the business environment, to us as citizens of India. So you'll find the major constraint, especially among the government or the non-government sector or the service industries, the ability to invest in IT infrastructure. And cloud computing, the key differentiator is it actually helps you to convert capital expenditure into revenue expenditure, and this could be the differentiator in making cloud work in India in a big way. Now you all know about the benefits of cloud computing, but before considering the benefits of cloud computing or before being carried away by the benefits of cloud computing, it's important to ask some key questions from the business perspective in terms of, will the cloud work for me? Am I aware of the risks I am taking by migrating to the cloud? And can you quantify the benefits which are going to come by migrating to the cloud? So regardless of the benefits which are presented by the vendors or by the IT professionals, it's important to ask some key questions pertaining to cloud. I've always believed that you don't need to know the mechanics of technology to use technology. What is important is you know how to use technology, which means you need to know basically how does the technology work and how can it benefit the business or your enterprise. So you need to have some basic concepts of technology, and primarily you should focus on how can make the technology work for your business. So if you look at cloud computing for your enterprise, it's important that you need to know what are the delivery models of cloud computing. What are the public cloud, hybrid cloud, and private cloud? You also need to know what are the different business areas where cloud computing could be deployed and what is going to be the difference by deploying cloud. You also need to be aware of what are the risks, and to mitigate the risks, what are the risk assessment strategy and what are the controls you need to have. Now, what are the key factors which determine what are the value you can derive from cloud and what are the risks of cloud computing? The first is the type of the cloud service models which are available. Now, should you go for a IaaS model, for a PaaS model, or a software service model, depends on the typical business enterprise. There is no ready-made formula which you can say that, okay, this is one particular formula and then the same formula is applicable for all enterprises. You need to understand the business process of your enterprise. You need to understand what is the current technology deployment, what are the future technology requirements, what are the business requirements, what are the projected business growth, based on which you need to decide what are the applications you need to deploy to the cloud and how you'll be able to migrate and move on the cloud. It's also important to consider what is the investment in the existing IT operations and how you're going to manage that. You also need to understand the risk assessment or the risk mitigation strategy of the enterprise. Each of the enterprise has their own risk appetite. So based on the business needs, what are the risk appetite and how will you manage this? Overall, they say information is the currency of the 21st century. So when you are migrating to the cloud, you are actually putting information of your enterprise on the cloud, and it's invisible, it's not available to you. And even otherwise, when the manual data which is there in a physical form gets migrated to the electronic form, as auditors we always have this problem of what is called as LOVE. Have you heard of this? As auditors, and especially if you look at managers of the olden era, they always had access to documents, records, etc. in a physical format. Now when this information or data which was there in a physical format gets digitized, they face this dilemma of LOVE, which is loss of visual evidence. So when you find that evidence which you need to look at, you need to sign some paper, you need to sign some document to get approvals, you need to view the information, you find this information is invisible, it's available in electronic form. Now at least you had the assurance when the data was digitized and it was available in your data center that it was available within your enterprise. Now when you find this data has migrated to the cloud, you don't know who can access this data. and where this data is available, and whether you can get the information when you want. So it's important that you need to ask some key questions pertaining to the business processes. So what are the key questions you need to ask primarily from a risk assessment perspective? First of all, you should be aware of what is the criticality of the data for your enterprise. Now, if this information or data is not available, what is the impact on your business? How long can you survive without this particular data? So you should know what is the critical availability. And it's important you need to have appropriate SLAs. You also need to know who will have access to this particular data, what is the mechanism you will have for providing access to this particular data. Technology has the solutions for all the issues, but it's important for the management to actually put in place a system of policy, procedures, standards, and guidelines which can ensure that technology works as per the business rules. You also need to know where the enterprise data is being located and how will you have a copy of this particular data. What are the disaster recovery capabilities of the cloud service provider? Quite often it's believed that you go for a large vendor and it's supposed to have all the capacities. But as far as you're concerned, it's important that you do not go by reputation, but you go based on facts. So regardless of the reputation of the vendor or who is providing this particular service, it's important that you know what is the capabilities of the vendor and does it meet your requirements. You also need to be aware of the security in terms of who can access this particular data and how secure this data is kept. So these are some of the fundamental questions you need to ask when you're migrating to the cloud. So basically, it's important that when you want to implement cloud computing in your enterprise and you're convinced that cloud computing is something which can bring value to you based on your business process, the next question would be, okay, how do I get assurance that this data which I'm actually handing over to a cloud service provider or to a vendor is secure and safe? So it's important you need to have an assurance about the security of this particular data. And this is where you need not reinvent the wheel. There are best practices available. And ISACA has brought out publications on cloud computing. If you look at the first publication, Cloud Computing Business Benefits to Security, Governance and Assurance Perspective, it's a white paper on cloud computing which explains what is cloud computing all about, what are the different service models, what are the different delivery models, how it could be useful for you. And if you're looking from the point of the business perspective, especially from the point of risk and security and assurance, what are the questions you need to ask? The second document, which is a very important document, especially if you're looking at auditing the cloud environment, is a publication called IT Control Objectives for Cloud Computing, which gives you the actual controls in terms of the questions you need to ask the cloud service provider or within the enterprise for the purpose of providing assurance in the cloud. And you also have simple guiding principles, which is a brief document which tells you if you're implementing cloud computing, what are the key guiding principles. And all these documents are available as a free download from ISACA's website. Now these are the two documents we talked about. Now let's look at what are the key assurance issues to be addressed when you're migrating to the cloud. The first and most important aspect is transparency. Now how much transparency is enough for you? Now you have passed this one, let's say you have taken the type of service which is required. It could be in terms of infrastructure as a service or a platform as a service or a software as a service. When you have handed over this service which is supposed to be provided by IT to the vendor, then you need to know, okay, what is that level of transparency? How do you know you can get access to this particular data? How do you know what are the best practices which are implemented by the particular the client? The second important thing is to look at the privacy. Every enterprise is subject to certain regulatory requirements. So in India also, as per the Information Technology Amendment Act 2008, you have certain privacy rules which are applicable for all enterprises. Now how does privacy impact you when you have migrated data to the cloud? So you need to ask, what is the type of data we are collecting, where is this data stored, and do we have the right policies, procedures, practice in place to take care of this privacy? And when you are migrating to the cloud, is the cloud service provider also taking care of this? The third aspect is about the compliance. There are a plethora of legislations which every enterprise has to comply with. When you're migrating to the cloud, the responsibility of compliance still vests with the enterprise. It doesn't get transferred to the service provider or the vendor. So it's important that you communicate to the vendor what are the compliance which are to be taken care of and ensure compliance of this particular regulations as relevant. You also need to be aware of where the data is stored and how does the data flow, and are there any implications in terms of the trans-border information flow. And if you require any certification for the security of data regarding any aspect of data, you also need to know what certifications are available to the enterprise and whether you can have an independent audit of this data assurance practices. Now let's look at COBIT and how COBIT controls can be used for auditing the cloud. I said when you're migrating to the cloud, it's important that you need to understand the business objectives. The technology has to be key enabler for the business. If that's the case, when you're using cloud computing as a key driver for your business growth, it's important that primarily you keep the business objectives in mind. So when you look at the business objectives in mind, first of all, you need to start with the business goals. What are the desired business goals which go beyond the current capabilities of IT? Now here you can use 3 primary publications which you have. All of them are available as a free download. One is called COBIT, which earlier version was 4.1, and this presentation is based on the 4.1 as far as this aspects are concerned pertaining to COBIT controls. You have COBIT 4.1, which gives you the best practices pertaining to implementing IT governance, assurance and control practices. You have Risk IT, which is a framework for managing risk within the enterprise. At a macro level, it tells you what should be the enterprise risk management strategy and how should you actually implement risk management within the enterprise, especially from the perspective of information technology. And the third one is VAL IT, which is focused on benefit realization. Every enterprise invests heavily in IT. And if you look at any component of expenditure of any enterprise, you find IT expenditure is a major component of the expense. If that is the case, you need to have processes in place to ensure benefit realization from this investment in IT. And this is where VAL IT could be useful. It gives you the practices you need to follow for the purpose of managing IT projects throughout the life cycle of IT, right from the conception of this particular IT idea to the implementation. Next, you also need to define what are the business opportunities available for you. By using a cloud platform or a cloud application, what are the new business opportunities which are risen? So if you have to use specific best practices, you can refer to PO, which is plan and organize, the domain of plan and organize, and the practice which is given 1.4. Similarly, if you look at VAL IT, you can use investment management 1.2, which focus on value governance. Next, you need to look at whether you can quantify the gains and how you can quantify the gains envisioned in the cloud application. Quite often you see a lot of projections about what are the benefits of cloud, but regardless of what overall opportunities are there in the cloud, you need to ask how does it help your enterprise? Can you quantify the gains of a cloud implementation within your enterprise? So to the extent possible, you need to quantify, and based on that you need to take the decision. It's definitely not advisable to migrate to a cloud platform just because the competitor has gone in for this, or you find the vendor has got an excellent presentation or offering, or it is going to bring down cost drastically. It's important that you need to look at what are the business gains and what are the business benefits. You also need to be clear about what are the specific cloud application process you need to use for the purpose of achieving stated goals. So you need to ask the vendor, okay, there may be a lot of offerings they have. Specifically for your enterprise, looking at your current business needs, looking at your future business goals, what is the type of service solutions they have and how they can be implemented. You also need to identify if there are compliance regulations and how these compliance regulations will be built in this or factored in the cloud computing solution. You need to verify all these aspects, compare these goals in terms of to what extent this is feasible, achievable, and then based on this you need to make a business case and implement the solution. Now let's look at some specific aspects of cloud computing, especially from the controls perspective. I've just picked up a few examples just to highlight how you can ask basic questions pertaining to information technology, governance, assurance, security and controls from a cloud computing perspective. Now these are adopted from the publication IT Control Objectives for Cloud Computing, which is published by ISACA. So if you see here, we have looked at the first aspect, which is pertaining to DS, which is deliver and support domain. This is given 4.9, and this talks about offsite backup storage. Now this tells you if you have offsite backup storage in the enterprise, what should be the best practice. So it says store offsite all critical backup data, media, documentation and other IT resources necessary for IT recovery and business continuity plans. Okay, then it says determine the content of backup storage in collaboration between the business process owners and the IT personnel. This is what is required. Now, primarily from a cloud computing perspective, you need to adopt these questions and say, when we are going for a cloud computing deployment, how is this best practice applied? So there are two questions you need to ask. First, is this best practice which is given in COBIT applicable for me? Is it relevant for me? If it is relevant or applicable for me, how do I customize and ensure that this is applied? And by applying, does it help my enterprise? Now, from a cloud computing perspective, you have these three platforms which are given, and you have a ready-made solution in terms of, okay, which is a high priority, which is a lower priority. For example, if you look at, in this particular case, offsite backup storage, you find as far as in the case of platform as a service, you find these are all high, whether it's public, private or hybrid platform, this becomes a high priority. And even in the case of SaaS, it becomes a high priority. So if you look at the next aspect, let's say 4.10, which talks about post-resumption review, in case of disaster or this one breakdown and you need to continue the business, what are the practices which are required? So it says the post-resumption review needs to analyze the effectiveness of the cloud service provider and the customer staff and the processes. In addition, it has to evaluate whether the cloud service provider has the ability and the resources to manage the customer's data and recovery needs. Now you need to ask specifically how the cloud service provider is going to provide the service to you as per your business requirements. So it's important you need to have the appropriate SLAs. Let's look at from the point of security. Security is given in DS5 in 4.1. DS, as I said, is deliver and service. So the best practice is ensure system security. This is the control objectives. There is a need to maintain the integrity of information and protect IT assets requires a security management process. So within your enterprise, do you have a security management process? Now, on account of migrating to the cloud, what is the impact of the security management process? Now, what should the process include? It also says this process includes establishing and maintaining IT security roles and responsibilities, policies, standards, and procedures. So you need to ask within the enterprise, do you have the appropriate roles and responsibilities clearly defined? Do you have the policies, the standards and guidelines and procedures? And when you're migrating to the cloud, how are you adopting or modifying this to suit your business needs? And if required, if the cloud service provider has to provide this, how is he taking care of these needs? So it's important that you map your policy, it's important that you map your procedure requirements and see how best you are able to get it implemented through the cloud service provider. You also need to look at management of the IT security. Now if you look at some of the findings, this is some example of actual scenario where audit was done of a cloud platform. Now this is what is given. Let's say we are talking about logical attacks, DS 5.10. This is what the cloud control objective says, which means the best practice from the cloud computing perspective. COBIT says that this is what you need to have, and you adopt this to make it an audit procedure which you're using for the purpose of audit by asking key questions, and you audit the existing platform or the way the cloud computing is implemented, and based on that you have a finding or an area of weakness. For example, in this particular case, you find the application teams currently manage the configuration of the cloud firewall instead of relying on the network engineering team, so which could result in a risk. Similarly, if you look at another aspect, exchange of sensitive data. Now in this case, the audit procedure would be inquire whether and confirm the data transmission outside the organization require encrypted format prior to transmission. Similarly, you need to inquire whether and confirm that sensitive data is controlled through application controls. So the findings are given in terms of what happened in the actual scenario. So if you look at the next aspect, which is database integrity, this is given from COBIT DS 11.6, and it gives you the audit procedure and you have a finding. So this is just an example of how COBIT 4.1 control objectives which are given as a ready-made document can be customized and used for your enterprise. Let's have a quick walkthrough of what is COBIT 5 all about. COBIT 5 is the latest offering from ISACA, which is the business framework for governance of enterprise IT. It primarily focuses on the business needs. It says how you can ensure that IT and business speak in the same language. The key aspect of COBIT 5 is ensuring stakeholder value. There are different stakeholders who have different needs. IT should meet the needs of the stakeholders. So COBIT provides a comprehensive framework which can be used by the business to achieve their goals. How does it do? It's based on the 5 principles. The first one is called as meeting stakeholder needs. You need to understand what are the stakeholder needs, and based on that you need to have mechanism for cascading the business needs into the IT needs. You need to ensure that the processes which are implemented within the enterprise cover the enterprise end to end. There are multiple or a plethora of frameworks which are available as best practices. It could be ISO 27001 or ITIL or CMM or PMBOK or various other frameworks. You need to know what is the most relevant framework for your enterprise and see this applicable for you. In this particular scenario, COBIT provides you a single integrated framework. It can be an umbrella framework under which you can actually embed or integrate other frameworks. It also provides you a holistic approach, and the most important aspect is it distinguishes governance from management. It's important that the senior management has to be involved in implementing IT and provide direction, and this is where the governance aspect is brought in. COBIT says there are 7 key enablers which are important for a successful IT deployment. It's important for the enterprise to see what is the status of these 7 enablers and how these are going to impact the enterprise. And that could be in terms of the processes. You need to have the right process in place. You need to have the right IT infrastructure or the organized structures. You need to have culture, ethics and behavior, principles, policies and framework, and there are other aspects also pertaining to the IT resources. As I said, in terms of the distinction between governance and management, it cascades from the governance to the management. Quite often you find that cloud computing or in IT deployment is considered as a contract which has to be signed by the senior management based on the budgets, which is not really true. It's important the senior management has to be involved in directing, evaluating, monitoring how IT is deployed within the enterprise. So primarily based on the needs of the business, which could be benefit realization or optimizing the risk and resource optimization. So the key differentiator when you're using COBIT 5 is it involves the senior management in ensuring that IT is integrated as a part of the business process and helps the enterprise in achieving the business goals. So this gives you a perspective how the business needs get integrated. So if you look at the governance perspective, this has 3 principles which is based on this ISO 38500, which talks about evaluate, direct and monitor. And you also have this connection with the management, which has 4 key domains, which is built on this PBRM principle: plan, build, run and monitor. And totally there are 37 processes covering each of these areas. To summarize, you need to understand that cloud computing has to be implemented from a business perspective, not from a technology perspective. Every technology investment comes with a risk and returns. It's important you need to balance the two and ensure value. You have to use the best practices for implementing controls, and there are ready-made best practices, and COBIT gives you a collection of best practices which you can interpret, understand, because based on common sense, you find there is no technology jargon used. And whatever be the technology deployment, it's important that you need to have an assurance, and this is where best practice can help you in getting an internal assurance or also getting the assurance from an external service providers. So you have COBIT best practices, which provides a principles-based approach. This is a research project which was done by ISACA in the last 3 years, and based on this you find this COBIT 5 is recently released and is available for you for use. So these are the references. So thank you very much.
Will right now say that my cloud is COBIT 5 compliant or stuff like that.
Okay, currently there is what is called as a COBIT process assessment model, which is based on COBIT 4.1. So if you have to benchmark your cloud practices, you need to you can use this process assessment model where you implement this COBIT best practices, and based on which you can get assessment in terms of what level you are, what level of maturity you are.
Okay, so somebody from ISACA will do my assessment?
Currently, there is a mechanism which has been put in place whereby from ISACA, let's say a CISA or a Seagate, there are particular certified professionals who have got the competence to be able to come and do this. Or you can do it internally. If you are doing it for internal assurance, you can study this, and based on that you can get an internal assurance whether you are implementing, because you are an IT professional and you, for your own satisfaction, you want to see whether you have implemented the best practices. You can pick up these best practices, benchmark it, check it as applicable for you, and based on that you can be sure whether it's applicable, how far you are satisfied, and what are the gaps, and how you can improve the weakness.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Examples of any companies adopting COBIT?
Now, if you look at the earlier version of COBIT, there are more than I think 1 lakh downloads of there. And COBIT 5 was released on 10th April 2012, just about 1.5 months back. And so far, I think more than 65,000 copies have been downloaded. So if you go to COBIT case studies, you will find examples of hundreds of enterprise, and you have countrywide examples. For example, in India, the Controller Auditor General of India is using it extensively for doing audit of all the government entities. They have an IT audit section which is used. Similarly, in the banking sector, the Reserve Bank of India has a separate inspection department, and they use it extensively for auditing all the financial organizations. Similarly, we should use the best practice from COBIT to issue guidelines to the bank saying, okay, if you're outsourcing, now these are the best practices you need to follow. And most of the IT companies who provide, let's say, IT governance, assurance, security services, they have some people who are experienced in COBIT.
Sure. But any cloud-related, cloud auditing examples, like what you shared is a general InfoSec purpose, but COBIT being used for cloud auditing by any of the companies, is there any example?
I think if you go, this is search on the internet, you should be able to get information.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, because this is released only recently, so I think there are enterprises which are used. And most of the, if you look at the contributors of this publication, this is not some research body who is doing it. There are people who are actually using, who are contributed this expertise. Based on this publication has been brought out. So if you look at the people who have contributed, the enterprise who have contributed, so you find that these are the people who have actually implemented this.
Sure, thanks.
Okay. So thank you very much. I hope this was useful. You can download this publication as said at this website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, on behalf of UBM, I'd like to present to Mr. Rafeq a small memento as a token of appreciation.